Good day. Today is Wednesday, 3rd September 2025. And well, yesterday, the various meetings that have been taking place in China, in Tianjin and in Beijing, the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the celebrations of China's victory against Japan in the Second World War, well, they all ended in a colossal military parade which took place in Beijing, along Chang'an Avenue, through Tiananmen Square, reviewed by the Chinese leadership and by the distinguished guests from the podium under the Tiananmen Gate. And it was, if I may say, a massively impressive display. I am not going to try to discuss the military technologies and equipment that the Chinese showcased. I'm not perhaps the best person to talk about these things. All I would say is that the sheer scale was staggering. That is one thing that stood out immediately. The numbers of weapons, the fact that we are looking at every conceivable type of weapon that you can imagine, from advanced fifth generation fighter jets to tanks to apparently laser weapons that fulfill some kind of air defense role, to intercontinental ballistic missiles, all of those things. And it was the other thing that could not but fail to impress was the extraordinary precision of the soldiers who were participating in the display. And, well, I've been told by people who are in the militaries that you can tell an awful lot about a military by the way in which the soldiers march, and certainly the marching that I saw in the film of the parade in Beijing, well, it seemed to me more than exemplary. So, a massive display, one that dwarfs in scale, if I could just say, the parade that took place in Moscow on the 9th of May. But then this is, to some extent, I think, also a reflection of the venue. Tiananmen Square is a far greater square, a much, much bigger parade area than Red Square is in Moscow. And that, of course, by definition, affects the scale of the parade, but it also changes its character. So the parade in Moscow had perhaps a greater level of intimacy and a closer connection maybe between the people in the reviewing stands and the soldiers marching past. Whereas, as I said, this parade in Beijing, massively impressive as it was, showcases scale and power perhaps more strikingly. Anyway, I'm not going to discuss the parade further. All I would say is this. We saw the parade in Moscow. We've seen parades in China. We've seen the exemplary marching of the Chinese military. We've seen the, I would say, slightly less exemplary marching of the Russians, but they are pretty good at marching too. And it does make a painful contrast with the quality of marching that we see from Western militaries today. A few weeks ago, President Trump arranged for a parade to take place in Washington, and the contrast between the marching in that parade and the marching first in Moscow and now in Beijing was, well, I'm going to say it is very, very great indeed, almost painful to behold. And to repeat again, military people have told me you can tell an awful lot about the morale and discipline of an army from the way the Soldiers' March, and I'm sure that is not the whole story, not by any means, but anyway, the contrast, for what it's worth, was there. Anyway, that concludes the events in China. There was something else about the parade that I thought was extremely interesting and very important, which is that on the podium, obviously, President Xi was in overall charge. He dominated the event, as the leader of China would be expected to do. But I noticed that on his right, sitting to the right of him, was President Putin of Russia, clearly in the place, the most important place of honor. And then on the left was Kim Jong-un. And there were pictures of the three of them together. Again, Xi Jinping in the center, Putin on the right, Kim Jong-un on the left. You saw them walking together, all of them looking very happy, I should say, to be there. But again, it's as if the Chinese, well, it's undoubtedly the case that the Chinese went out of their way to single these two leaders out as the most important guests at this parade. Now, it must be said that Prime Minister Modi of India was not there. He's just before the visit to China. Modi had also visited Japan, and India has good relations with Japan. And I suspect that Prime Minister Modi would have calculated, and his officials would have calculated, and by the way, India has extremely capable diplomats and officials, and they would certainly have given the correct advice about this. They would have calculated that a trip to a parade in Beijing celebrating a Chinese victory over Japan might not go down very well in Japan, which is a country which, as I said, Prime Minister Modi had just visited and which he has just persuaded to make further and bigger investments in India. So it's understandable that Modi stayed away. And in his absence, it's perhaps logical that Putin specifically would be given such an important position as the main guest. And it was interesting also that there were various discussions that took place between the Chinese and the Russians, between Xi and Putin. And Xi, the president of China, said something which I can't help but think was a response to certain rather unfortunate comments that President Trump of the United States has previously published on Truth Social. Anyway, Xi said that it was China and Russia, China and the Soviet Union, that had been the primary victors in the Second World War. And this was clearly intended to signal to the United States that actually your contribution was nowhere near as central as President Trump has been implying. China and Russia bore the heaviest casualties by far. In the case of China, they were involved in the war for much longer than the United States. It's important to say that for China, the Second World War began in 1937 when Japan attacked China. For Britain and France and Germany, the Second World War began in September 1939, and for Poland too. For the Soviet Union, it began in June 1941, and for the United States, it began in December 1941. So China had already been fighting for 4 years, more than 4 years, by the time that the United States joined the Second World War. And of course, its casualties were vastly greater. And as the Chinese correctly point out, both before and for much of the Second World War, even after the United States became involved, the bulk of the Japanese armies were fighting in China. And this is a war which the Chinese government and the Chinese people absolutely correctly feel that the West has largely ignored and massively neglected. In Russia recently, they have been making a major effort to educate their people about China's contribution in the Second World War. And I believe that there is now much greater awareness of the role that China played in the Second World War. But in the West, I'm sorry to say that there continues to be almost none. But anyway, Xi Jinping making this point that it was China and Russia that made the great contribution to the Allied victory, of course does something else. It singles these two countries out as the victors of the Second World War, but also as the guardians, the trustees of the victory, the attempts to revise its outcome, to justify some of the actions that were taken in Japan and Germany in the lead up to the Second World War, to justify the ideological developments that we've seen happen in Europe, in Ukraine, elsewhere over the last few years, and the Chinese would say also. So saying this, pointing out that Russia and China as the main victors, but also the trustees of the outcome of the victory, which both the Russians and the Chinese, Putin and Xi, have often spoken of in philosophical and ideological terms as the victory of the Chinese and the Russians, and of course of the Allies, against the ideologies that took root in Germany and Central Europe and in Japan. Anyway, saying that and talking about China's and Russia's role and joint trusteeship is also a way of binding those two countries politically together. It signals that China and Russia have, more than any other countries in the world, a joint responsibility and a joint connection and obligation to their ancestors to preserve the outcome of the war, and therefore have a community of interest which continues to this day. So that was part of what that was all about. But all right, the prominence given to Putin, extended to Putin, who is after all the leader of a great power, and a power with which China now has a very strong growing community of interest. I discussed the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline extensively in my program yesterday. But what explains the presence of Kim Jong-un? Now, it's been fairly, I think, well established that after Xi Jinping first became paramount leader of China, his relations with Kim Jong-un were not particularly close, and there were tensions between China and North Korea. And at one time, the Chinese and the Russians were agreeing in the Security Council to vote for extensive sanctions against North Korea. And I remember reading, this is not so long ago, critical articles in the Chinese media about North Korea and, by the way, about Kim Jong-un personally. So that was not that long ago. And I should say that the Russians were always much more measured in what they had to say about North Korea. I can remember that Putin, at one point, even as Russia was supporting sanctions against North Korea, I can remember Putin going out of his way to say that North Korea was a state, an internationally recognized state, and as such merited a certain respect. That was an unusual comment coming from any world leader at that particular time, but I remember Putin said it. But nonetheless, the Russians continued to support sanctions against North Korea at that time. They weren't prepared to break with the Chinese on that issue. And of course, the Americans were pursuing sanctions against North Korea also at that time. So there has been, it's impossible to deny this, a major change in attitudes towards North Korea and its leader. The Russians, over the last few years, especially since the start of the special military operation, have established what must be, in all terms, described as an extremely friendly and cordial relationship with North Korea. They've renewed a long-standing treaty with North Korea, which classifies North Korea as an ally, a military ally. North Korea has obligations to come to Russia's defense in the event that Russia is attacked. And Kim Jong-un made absolutely sure that that part of the agreement was honored by apparently offering, and I understand even insisting, that the Russians agree to the deployment of a North Korean force to Kursk region. And Kim Jong-un, over the last couple of weeks, has been going out of his way to commemorate and congratulate the North Korean soldiers who participated in that operation. He's met with several of the veterans. He's comforted the relatives of some of the soldiers who died. There's pictures of him weeping over the coffins of some of the soldiers who died. It's clearly been done to highlight, again, North Korea's contribution to this battle. But of course, the primary purpose of a lot of this is to tell the Russians, look, we did this to you. We came to your help. If we ever get into trouble, if we ever face military attacks from the United States, from South Korea, from Japan, we do this to you, you must reciprocate. You must do this for us too. So there is now a military obligation on Russia also to come to North Korea's defense. And of course, this repeats provisions made in treaties that the Soviet Union and North Korea agreed with each other, I believe in the 1960s, when they were absolutely allies. But the fact remains that the treaty was updated, that provision was there, and both the North Koreans and the Russians have gone out of their way to say that this is an actual live commitment. It's not just a form of words. And we see that Kim Jong-un has ensured that an actual, concrete, substantive step was taken through the deployment of the North Korean troops to a Kursk region to demonstrate that it is a living commitment as well. And, well, it's not obviously just military relations, because The Russians and the Chinese, the Russians and the North Koreans have been working increasingly closely with each other on economics. It's clear that the Russians are now heavily involved in the North Korean economy again. They are undoubtedly sourcing artillery shells and other weapons from North Korea. There's been pictures of Kokshan artillery pieces from North Korea operating in the area of the special military operation. The Russians also seem to have imported ballistic missiles and perhaps multiple launch rocket systems from North Korea as well. So the Russians have been involved in importing goods from North Korean factories, military goods from North Korean factories, which will also mean, and I've had significant input and information about this, it means that the Russians are now providing machine tools for these factories. Their technicians are there. They're helping to upgrade their production. But there is no doubt as well that the Russians are also active in other sectors in the civilian economy in North Korea as well. And, well, the Chinese now are signaling that they're doing the same thing, because there is no doubt anymore that North Korea, from a Chinese point of view, has fully come in from the cold. A few years ago, at the time when Donald Trump was meeting with Kim Jong-un, I remember that Kim Jong-un was able to resume his trips to China. I remember that he had what looked like a very friendly summit meeting with Xi Jinping. So already it's clear that the relationship between North Korea and China has become much closer. But the fact that Kim Jong-un was the second guest of honor at the celebrations of the victory over Japan, which took place yesterday, underlines this fact. And any assumptions, any theories that have existed, and they've been fairly commonplace in the West, that the Chinese are somehow uncomfortable by the growing relationship between North Korea and Russia, I think we could say definitely was refuted by the pictures we saw yesterday of Xi, Putin and Kim all together. I've always made the point in program after program that it is inconceivable to me that the Russians would have pursued the close ties with North Korea, which they have done and which they have now achieved, without first getting China's agreement. And, well, we can see now that this is definitely a team of leaders, all of them working together. Now, saying all of this, it is important also to say that from a Chinese perspective, and indeed from a Russian perspective, North Korea is also one of the victors and one of the allies of China and Russia in the Second World War. Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, was a significant resistance leader in Korea. There's been much debate and denial about this in the West, but academic scholarship now has concluded in the West that Kim Il-sung did indeed play a key role in Korean resistance against the Japanese. The Japanese, of course, having occupied Korea from long before the Second World War and right during the Second World War as well. And, of course, North Korea and China were also allies, close allies, in the Korean War against the United States and the Western powers, who were, of course, at that time, by the way, claiming to be the United Nations with some legal basis. I'm not going to explore that in this program. But anyway, there is this former war that the Chinese and the North Koreans fought alongside each other, which is taken very seriously in China and is well remembered there. And, so that is another reason to commemorate the joint struggle of the Koreans and the Chinese during the Second World War against Japan. And of course, China, like Russia, is also a military ally of North Korea's. I remember even at a time when Chinese-North Korean relations were still strained, articles appeared, I believe it was in 2018, written in the Chinese media, which reiterated that for all the difficulties in the relations, if there was ever a US attack on North Korea, China would be there to defend it. So it's unsurprising in some respects that Kim Jong-un is there. But it demonstrates the diplomatic revolution that has taken place, because this was a leader who was for a time out in the cold. He's pressed forward with his nuclear weapons programs. He now has intercontinental ballistic missiles. He's upgraded his conventional army significantly. He's now sent his technicians the task of building nuclear-powered submarines, not just submarines that can carry nuclear weapons, but submarines which will be powered by nuclear reactors. And despite all of that, despite earlier Chinese-Russian misgivings about all of this, he's now back in. He's now a welcome and trusted ally. And of course, he also gets economic assistance from China, just as he is from Russia. I've never been to North Korea, but I have been in contact with people who have. They all say the same thing, that there are clear signs, not just of an economic revival in North Korea, but of a rapidly growing economy. And it is not just confined to Pyongyang, where the metro has been completely refurbished and where large residential neighborhoods in extraordinary modernist architecture have also been built. Right across North Korea, there has been a visible signs of improvement in general economic conditions. So this must be, again, put down to extraordinary mistakes on the part of the West. The West has acted very confrontationally towards North Korea, the United States especially. The United States in the 1990s appeared to have come to various agreements with North Korea, whereby North Korea agreed that it would not pursue a nuclear weapons program in return for a lifting of sanctions and supply by the United States of pressurized water reactors to North Korea to help the country deal with its long-standing energy problems. The United States went back on that deal and reimposed sanctions. North Korea proceeded to develop its nuclear weapons capabilities, and despite some serious attempts by President Trump, which were obstructed at every level within the US bureaucracy, and which received no understanding or support from the larger US foreign policy establishment, not to mention the European foreign policy establishment. Notwithstanding all of those ultimately unsuccessful attempts by President Trump, North Korea was kept out in the cold. The attempts to isolate it from China and Russia ultimately failed because the United States eventually came after both China and Russia, and the great beneficiary has been Kim Jong-un. He looks more secure in his position than he has ever done. I think it is inconceivable at this point in time that his authority in North Korea has not increased to even greater levels. There must be a widespread sense in North Korea, at least amongst the leadership there, but probably amongst much of the population, that Kim Jong-un is proving a very successful leader of North Korea indeed. Chalk this down as another extraordinary achievement of the neocons and of their lock grip of US foreign policy. They have managed to bring North Korea in from the cold. Well, I don't think that the United States should have aimed to try to destabilize or overthrow the government of North Korea. I think engagement with North Korea would have been the way forward. I think if North Korea had been persuaded to open up, as it looked like it was ready to do in the 90s, and again when Donald Trump was meeting with Kim Jong-un, well, who knows, developments in North Korea might have taken an entirely different turn. But we are where we are, and we have the obstruction and resistance to any change of approach from the neocons to explain this. There's been some facetious comments. Actually, I think they may be facetious, but they're fairly much on point. That if Donald Trump wants his Nobel Peace Prize, he's now got the grounds for it. He's brought India and China together. He's achieved that. He's made these former adversaries into what Xi Jinping calls partners. Perhaps in time they will even become friends, as they were for a certain time in the 1950s. Just saying. So maybe Donald Trump deserves a Nobel Prize for that. It's a facetious comment, but I can understand why people are making it. But, well, I unequivocally welcome, as I made clear in my programme yesterday, the rapprochement between India and China. I think it is an entirely good thing and one which should be welcomed. About North Korea, anything that benefits and improves the conditions of the North Korean people is a good thing, I personally believe. But of course, North Korea has its own unique style of government, which is not one that I understand and can relate to. And it is, of course, in conflict, in dangerous conflict with South Korea and with the West. Here, I have to say, I am concerned about the extent to which North Korea has come in from the cold without these relations between North and South Korea having been improved first. I would have liked to see that happen, but it has not happened. It means that South Korea is now in a weaker position relative to North Korea than it might otherwise have been. And, well, the general security situation in Northeast Asia is much more precarious as a result. But put that aside, put aside my own misgivings about this. You could see, again, the price the West pays for the lock grip, the neocons, and the thinking that they have fostered. The price the West pays because of this. So I'm not going to discuss this further, but I'm going to say one thing, and this derives to a great extent from a live stream that we did on the Duran, which I would strongly advise you to go and watch on the Duran, between ourselves, that's to say Alex Christoforou, and myself, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Because over the course of this live stream, one thing, it seemed to me, became increasingly clear, and that is that what we have seen, what we saw in Tianjin and in Beijing, and indeed in previous meetings, including perhaps the very important BRICS meeting that took place in Kazan last year, which I noticed Xi Jinping referenced extensively in various comments that he made over the course of the last couple of days. Anyway, what we are seeing is the 21st century start to take shape. Now, it's a well-known meme amongst historians, even academic historians, that centuries in political, historical time don't always exactly correspond to their dates. So, for example, you often hear it said, even amongst academic historians, that the 19th century began in 1815 and ended in 1914. And one could see that that is true. One could see why that might be true. There is a kind of unity in politics and economics and history and cultural and social and intellectual development in the century between 1815 and 1914. 1914 was the end, and it was in 1914 that the true 20th century began, with all its ideological conflicts, the Russian Revolution, the rise of communism, the events in Central Europe, the disastrous events in the Central Europe in the 1930s, the world wars, all of those things, the Cold War. The East Asians, the Eurasians, the Global South are thinking increasingly in 21st century terms. Whereas we in the West, our leaders, are still stuck in 20th century thinking. They continue to play the same tired, exhausted geopolitical games that they've become used to from the 20th century. The old games of dueling with the Russians in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine itself. You can even see revivals of attempted revivals of 20th century ideologies, discredited and, in my opinion, terrible 20th century ideologies in Ukraine. It's as if the war in Ukraine is the last 20th century war. And you could see this in the kind of rhetoric that we have in Europe. People invoking all the time Munich, 1938, Churchill, Chamberlain, all of this, trotting out the stories of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. All of this continues to frame our thinking, even as the rest of the world has now moved massively beyond this. Tianjin and Beijing and Kazan look like not just the future, but the present. Whereas the meeting that's going to take place tomorrow, the meeting in Paris of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, what does that look like, if not the past? Leaders of countries that in the 20th century were still great powers, continuing to behave as if they were the great powers now that they were in, say, 1940, conducting the same kind of geopolitical games that they were playing out then. The Americans also still thinking about the world in ultimately great power, 20th century great power terms, still in many cases focused on Europe, imagining that it is Europe which is the board upon which the key game is being played, as was true in the 20th century, when of course Europe was still economically and culturally and politically dominant. Even, as I said, as the rest of the world, China, India, the other BRIC states, move on and go about their business and make their deals with each other, the Paris-Siberia 2 pipeline, and all of that. We are the past. They're not just the future. They're the present too. And the sooner we understand this and get to grips with it, the better for us it will be. Well, let's move on and discuss not perhaps these sweeping things, which, as I said, we do nonetheless need to keep at the back of our minds. But let's now turn again to the dreary events, tragic events that continue to play out in Europe. President Trump of the United States has now resurfaced. There's been an absence which inspired all sorts of vacuous commentary, which I'm not going to waste my time on. But anyway, he's again, I've noticed, trotted out his same points about the fact that he's disappointed with President Putin. He says this all the time, regularly, and then he has a meeting with Putin and he takes it all back and progress is made and all sorts of things. Anyway, President Trump talks about how disappointed he is with Putin. He didn't announce any new initiatives. He didn't announce any new plans. There was an article in the London Times which said that effectively President Trump's approach, his peace initiative with respect to Ukraine has hit a wall. I've been saying this for some time. Others, of course, have been saying it too. Anyway, that's President Trump. The leaders in Europe continue to talk about ceasefires, which of course President Trump has rejected. They continue to hold meetings with each other, as they're just about to do in Paris, the Coalition of the Willing, Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Britain, my Prime Minister, President Macron, Friedrich Merz. They're all going to be meeting in Paris. I'm not going to discuss this meeting again. I've spoken about it at great length, both in yesterday's programme and in the programme the day before. I would add, by the way, that bond yields in Britain are continuing to rise, and I gather that they're doing the same in France and in the United States also. And there's said to be a movement towards gold and all of that. I'm not going to discuss what all that means, certainly not in this programme. But anyway, there are signs of economic and financial stress. And by the way, just as I mentioned economic matters, I noticed that in August, industrial production in the United States contracted again. It has been doing so almost continuously since the end of the spike, the expansion that took place following the lifting of the lockdowns. So industrial production in the United States has curved downwards and continues to curve downwards. There was a small upward blip in February, directly after President Trump's election. But since then, rather inauguration, but since then it's been a gradual, slow decline. Anyway, this is not apparently important. Sending troops to Ukraine, talking about ceasefires, coming up with ideas about coalitions of the willing. All of that is, even though the militaries are against it, the people are against it, and in Germany itself, apparently the idea, for the moment at least, has been dropped, at least of Germany itself participating. But anyway, they're going to go and continue to hold all of those meetings. But in the meantime, Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has been talking again. So is Putin, but in this instance it's Lavrov who I found more interesting, because what Lavrov has again said is that in order for there to be a peace agreement in ending the conflict, an actual, stable, long-term peace agreement, the four regions as part of Russia, the status of the four regions as part of Russia, and I understood him to mean the four regions, Zaporozhye and Kherson, as well as Donetsk, Lugansk, plus of course Crimea, that their status as part of Russia needed to be internationally recognized. In other words, not just recognized by Ukraine, but recognized by the Western powers as well. And, well, there may be some interpretation about what Lavrov meant, but I understood him to mean the entirety of the four regions. In other words, all of Zaporozhye and all of Kherson regions, as well as Donetsk and Lugansk. Now, this is not necessarily in contradiction to the various reports that have been circulating in the media for some time, that the Russians suggested or perhaps agreed at the various meetings with Witkoff and between Putin and Trump in Alaska that there would be a ceasefire in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, provided the Ukrainians pulled back from Donbass, from Donetsk and Lugansk. The Russians, as I understand it, have been continuing to say that they expect eventually, as part of an agreement, the entirety of Zaporozhye and Kherson to be transferred to themselves. But they might perhaps for a period of time be prepared to accept a ceasefire along the existing conflict lines, provided that they had confidence that these territories would indeed eventually be transferred to them. But anyway, I think Lavrov's words, if I have interpreted them correctly, nonetheless still show that the Russians do want eventually the entirety of Zaporozhye and Kherson to be transferred to Russia, and that they do want that fact to be internationally recognized. Now, I don't know that this is widely understood in the West. Again, maybe the haste with which the Anchorage meeting took place meant that all of these points were simply not ironed out. And maybe the Americans don't understand that the Russians, even if they agree to a temporary ceasefire in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, do ultimately want the entirety of these territories to be transferred to them. Just as I think that the Russians on their side might suppose that Trump and the Americans have shown greater interest in revisiting the topic of the reorganization of the security architecture in Europe than they have actually done. But anyway, Lavrov has clarified the point, at least as far as I can see. Zaporozhye and Kherson region, within their existing administrative boundaries, continue to be seen by the Russians as Russian territory, and the Russians do expect eventually, as part of a peace agreement, the entirety of these territories, including the cities of Zaporozhye and Kherson, to be transferred back to them. So anyway, I thought I would mention that. And, well, to say it straightforwardly, I cannot imagine any set of circumstances where the Europeans or the Americans agree to this. I think that the Europeans absolutely would not agree to this. I think even if there was an AfD government in Germany, for example, I think that that government also would probably find this too much to swallow. And I absolutely cannot imagine any scenario whatsoever where the Americans accept this. It would be inconceivable to me that any administration, whether it be this one or any future one, would, in the existing geopolitical realities, recognize these territories formally as Russian. And I cannot imagine that Congress would accept that either. Of course, in time, things may change. If we'd been speaking in, say, 1950, it would have been very, very difficult to imagine then that the United States would recognize the existing government in China, the government of the People's Republic of China, as the true government of China. But of course, in the late 1970s, almost 30 years later, that is what the United States did eventually do. But in the existing realities that we face today, I have to say, I think that is all but impossible. And again, I'm not sure that the Americans understand that, and I'm not sure that Donald Trump understands this. And the impossibility of this Russian demand and perhaps expectation really does cast a massive question mark over whether we can see a negotiated peace. Not, though, that we should stop trying. That's a different thing completely. Now, that then brings me to the state of the war. And over the last few hours, there's been another massive missile and drone strike by the Russians against Ukraine. Most of the targets appear to have been located in central and western Ukraine. Hundreds of drones, perhaps 500 Geranium True drones altogether, or something roughly of that size. Lots of missiles as well, all launched against targets in Ukraine. Huge amount of damage done. I'm not going to discuss in this program the extent of that damage. No doubt by tomorrow the Russian military will be providing us with more information about it. But there have been some very interesting additional pieces of information from the front lines. And shortly before I started making this program, the Russian Defense Ministry started to publish videos showing Russian troops in Kupiansk. And not just in Kupiansk, but in the center of Kupiansk, one near to the, apparently in the close proximity to the town hall building, or so I understand, in other key places within Kupiansk itself. Now, there's been a lot of surprise about General Gerasimov's announcement a few days ago when he made his great overview about the military situation in Ukraine that the Russians have not only effectively encircled the remaining Ukrainian troops in Kupiansk, but are in possession of half of the town. President Zelensky, of course, angrily denied that this was the case, or at least he insisted that all of the various things that Gerasimov was saying were untrue. I have said in previous programs, on the contrary, that if you had been following accounts of the fighting in, say, Kupiansk, from Russian channels, from places like Radovka and TASS and elsewhere, you would have known that there was street fighting going on in Kupiansk for some time, and that the Russians had indeed engaged in an encirclement operation of the Ukrainians there, and you would not have been so surprised by this news. But anyway, we now have that confirmation. The Russians do appear to be in control, perhaps of half of Kupiansk. The Russian Defense Ministry implied more than half. It could be that the days of Ukrainian control of Kupiansk are indeed coming to an end, and, well, the Russians have provided us with the video footage to confirm it. There's been reports of Russian counterattacks, of Ukrainian counterattacks in the Kupiansk area. The Ukrainians were supposed to have recaptured a particular village, presumably in order to break through to Kupiansk itself. I have expressed my doubts about those claims, and the Russians, for their part, have published their own video footage from the same village, which appears to show it firmly under Russian control. Now, I've expressed my doubts about some of these Ukrainian claims at counterattacks. Yesterday, the Ukrainians also published claims that they'd launched a counterattack in the village of Udachny, southwest of Pokrovsk. The Russians indicated that they'd captured Udachny some days ago. There's been reports from the Russian part of the internet that Udachny has fallen under Russian control. The Russian Defense Ministry, to my knowledge, has so far made no claim at all about Udachny, which suggests that there is still fighting going on around the village. But there had been fairly reliable claims from very reliable Russian sources that Udachny was indeed under Russian control. And, well, the Ukrainians published footage which appeared to show the Ukrainians recapturing a particular building in Udachny and firing a anti-tank grenade at that particular building. Now, Radovka did another discussion of this particular Ukrainian film. They recently published what they said was a rebuttal of the Ukrainian claims, the Ukrainian video of the tank in Pokrovsk firing at an apartment building. They said that the footage was obviously staged, and a tank unprotected by infantry would never have been deployed in that way, and that this was clearly something that was staged for the cameras. Anyway, Radovka are making the same claim about this video footage, about the incident in Udachny. They're saying that the footage was clearly made, was filmed in the spring. They provide reasons to think that, and I'm not going to go into what those reasons were. I'm barely able to make any sense of the video myself. But anyway, the Radovka says that this footage is old, that the Ukrainians occasionally do make films, whilst they're in control of a particular location, which they then release later in order to give the impression that they are still in control of that location after the location in question has already passed under Russian control. And they are claiming that this is what has happened with the footage of the counterattack in Udachne. Now, to repeat again, I am not there. I am not in touch with the soldiers on the ground, Russian or Ukrainian. The Russian and the Ukrainian general staffs do not provide me with information about the ongoing state of the battle. And always one has to be careful of confirmation bias. I have been skeptical about some Ukrainian claims about counterattacks, and well, it's dangerous because the Russians are saying that this Ukrainian counterattack never happened. To assume that that must be true, one must take into account the fact that one is already biased to believe that what the Russians are saying about this counterattack might be true. Just saying. But for all that, I mean, I admit I do have my biases, and I do also follow the war very carefully. And I have to say that I am inclined to believe Radovka's rebuttal. We've seen that the evidence of the counterattack in Kupiansk appears to have been wrong, and I suspect the same is true about the counterattack in Udachne. Just as I also believe that the counterattack with the tank in Pokrovsk was also probably staged. Anyway, that brings me now to the situation in Pokrovsk. There are further reports of Russian advances within the city. Even as I am making this program, I'm seeing reports appearing that Russian troops have reached the center of Pokrovsk through another pipe. This story repeats itself constantly. It happened in Avdiivka, it happened in Sudzha, it supposedly happened in Pokrovsk itself. I see that these reports seem to be originating from Ukrainian sources. I'm always skeptical about these pipeline stories, though the Avdiivka and Sudzha stories turned out to be mostly true. I wonder, however, again I'm showing my bias and skepticism here, I wonder whether, however, this isn't a way for the Ukrainians to finally admit what has been clear to me for some time, which is that the Russians do indeed hold positions in central Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians have been trying to push back against these claims for some time. Now they've discovered this pipe and they say that this is how the Russians got to central Pokrovsk, though there is good reason to think that they have actually been in central Pokrovsk for quite some time. So anyway, that is what I think about this particular story. I accept I might be wrong. It may be that the Russians have infiltrated to central Pokrovsk through a pipe. What difference ultimately does it make if the Russians do actually have positions in central Pokrovsk? This story further strengthens my belief that the defense of Pokrovsk is collapsing. Whenever one of these pipeline stories appears, it always seems to precede the collapse of the Ukrainian defense wherever it is taking place. We had the pipeline story in Avdiivka, and then Avdiivka almost immediately fell. We had the pipeline story in Sudzha, in Kursk region, and Sudzha almost immediately fell. Perhaps this time in Pokrovsk, much bigger place than either Avdiivka or Sudzha, it is going to be different. But, well, we have that experience behind us. I strongly suspect that over the next couple of weeks, Pokrovsk will indeed fall. The Russians have also released footage from the area of the Kupiansk reservoir. I've actually seen, for the first time, by the way, in a video, actual film of the Kupiansk reservoir. And I have to say, it looks like a big lake, but nothing more than that. It's absolutely not a huge water body. Somebody could certainly swim across it if they were a reasonably good swimmer, or so it seems to me. Of course, the water probably by now is starting to get cold, but then fresh water often is. But anyway, I've seen pictures. The Russians are shelling the north bank of the Kupiansk reservoir, which I take as a further sign that they have indeed gained full control of the southern bank of the Kupiansk reservoir. Because if not, why would they be shelling there? So the battle for Konstantinovka is intensifying. There is further news in the Pokrovsk area that the Russians are now pushing into Mirnograd, and that they're fighting for the village of Shakove, which the Ukrainians seem to be defending and seem to be pulling out all the stops to defend, even though they run a serious risk, according to Redovka again, of being surrounded there. So anyway, that is the state of the war at the present time. Well, we also have intensifying concerns about the situation in the Middle East. A massively unreported story is of a row that has erupted between Iran and Russia, by the way. An Iranian politician and certain media outlets in Iran claimed that Russia had assisted Israel in its attacks on Iran in June by providing intelligence information about Iranian military facilities to Israel. The Russians were absolutely furious by these comments, and the Russian Foreign Ministry has published a very stern statement about it. Iranian officials have rushed to say that the Iranian politician who talked in this way was speaking out of turn, and that the media outlets in Iran that repeated these allegations were wrong about this also. And well, there are also multiple reports in the West, in Iran and Russia, that despite all of these tensions, the situation between Iran and Russia continues to go on track. Pezeshkian and Putin, incidentally, had a friendly meeting in China over the course of the SCO meeting. And I believe, though I'm not absolutely sure, that Pezeshkian remained in Beijing for the celebration of China's victory over Japan in the Second World War. But we see the tensions and a certain level, a certain undercurrent of hostility continue to exist and bedevil the relations between Iran and Russia. I should say that the hostility, as far as I am aware, is entirely on the Iranian side. But as I've said, there is a history between Iran and Russia, and there is some good reason, or at least there is some reason for this hostility. Anyway, I still believe we are set for a very troubled autumn, and we will probably see, in fact I'm sure we will see, Pokrovsk fall over the course of this autumn, and quite likely Siversk and Kupiansk will fall too. Kupiansk, it seems to me, likely to fall very soon. What Western leaders are going to do in response to all of this, I don't know. But for the moment, it seems to me that they're holding more meetings. They're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic with every one of these meetings. They seem blind to the changes in the world that continue to take place all around them. Well, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Stars by going to our shop, links under this video. Please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.